Hello, everyone. Welcome to City Lights. I'm Peter Maravellis. And for those of you online, welcome to you too. And thank you for joining us. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush peoples. It is always an honor and a privilege to be able to do so. So, a very auspicious occasion. We've been doing more and more of these, and it's such a pleasure because, as many of you probably know, City Lights is also a publisher as well as a bookstore. And to have award-winning investigative journalist Will Potter with us is such a thrill. We have had the great pleasure of publishing him before. And of course, we are celebrating this new book, Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable. City Lights, as I mentioned, published Green is the New Red, an insider's account of a social movement under siege. But in Little Red Barns, Will Potter investigates the powerful forces at work hiding the harms of industrial agriculture, its significant role in the climate crisis, and its links to the rise of global fascism. So this book arrives to us in a very timely way, and I think really puts a lot of things in perspective that are happening as we speak. Will Potter is an award-winning investigative journalist, as I mentioned. He focuses on social justice and environmental movements and attacks on civil liberties. He was the first investigative journalist to be named a TED Senior Fellow and has been invited to address governmental bodies about his reporting. These include the U.S. Congress, Australian Parliament, and the Council of Europe. We're going to have a little Q&A after his presentation. And of course, we'll have book signing. For those of you who are online, please post your questions and comments in the chat function from where we will retrieve them. And for those of you here, please wait until I get to you with a microphone. Otherwise, our friends online are not going to be able to hear your questions. So please join us now in giving Will Potter a very warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Well, you're a special group coming out for such a cheery and uplifting topic. As Elaine and I have been discussing, this is a beach read, as you call in the industry. So I appreciate everyone coming out, especially in these times. I mean, it's kind of a mixed blessing to be doing these events right now. It's a little surreal, but it also feels good because with everything going on in the world, I think we need to be gathering in places like City Lights and talking about resistance and how we defend democracy right now. So it's been a minute since I've been back in City Lights in this capacity. Green is the New Red was published in 2011. And I thought what I would do is kind of give an abridged version of the, we'll say, circuitous route that it took to arrive with the final product of the book and what was intending to be a short-term investigation and turned into really a 10-year project. And then, as we said, we'll do some Q&A. So when the whole point of Green is the New Red, we were trying to sound the alarm of how environmentalists and animal activists were being labeled by the FBI as the #1 domestic terrorism threat, even though they've never harmed a human being. And as I was working on that book, my intention was to try to help other social movements and people who don't know about this type of activism understand what was really at stake when we start criminalizing things like protest and civil disobedience, tree sits and road blockades, leafleting, chalking slogans on the sidewalk. All of those things were being labeled as terrorism. And then as soon as the book came out, though, literally that year, as I was doing speaking events like this one, I saw a radical expansion that I didn't anticipate. When I was speaking before those governmental bodies, it was making an argument that's really a classic civil liberties argument that if we don't defend speech that's more on the margins, it moves towards the mainstream, right? And puts all of us at risk. And then what happened in 2011 after Green is the New Red came out is it wasn't people that were vandalizing SUVs and breaking windows or even setting fire to logging equipment being labeled as terrorists. All of a sudden, it was people taking photographs of factory farms. That's it. They weren't stealing animals. They weren't, waging some terror campaign as part of that. They were documenting what happens every single day. And the reason that was so damning is these investigations in a short amount of time really started redefining the national and international dialogue about what is happening on farms. For most Americans, we've been so removed from animal agriculture and just farming in general. It used to be just a few generations ago that most people had something to do with the food that's being raised, that they consumed. Even the clothes we wear and it was much more local in our economies. And then as farming changed, we became more and more separated. What the investigations did was really bring consumers face to face with that reality. And the truth is that there's almost 10 billion animals every year in the United States alone that are raised and killed for food, that virtually goes unseen and unnoticed. There isn't any really federal oversight mechanism. The Animal Welfare Act specifically exempts what happens on farms. Under that law, animals are defined to exclude any animals raised on farms. So by definition, in this very Orwellian way, what happens to animals on factory farms can't be considered cruelty because they're not considered animals. Right. Some of the stuff we'll talk about today, it feels like a little, I might be exaggerating or making this stuff up, but this is the landscape right now. So what started at that time, there was this massive shift in both journalism and how what technology was available. So all of a sudden we're all glued to these, right? iPhones and smartphones started becoming ubiquitous. The technology of video recording, it used to be like, 10 years before that, was really cumbersome and heavy and expensive. The editing equipment was cumbersome and expensive. It was very professionalized. And all of a sudden, you had a dynamic where people could record stuff on their phones or using equipment bought on Amazon. You could publicize it yourself through social media and get millions of views on YouTube and on Facebook accounts. That democratized what was traditionally in investigative journalism, a very specialized practice, right? So you have these nonprofit groups that could go out as journalism was in some ways declining and investigative journalism was being shut down in a lot of news operations because of a lack of money. You had people that had the tools. So all of a sudden news was being made by these animal rights investigators. And that's a long way of saying the industry absolutely freaked out about this. And as I mentioned, as soon as that first book came out, there was no ramping up period. There was no warm up to go after more and more groups as terrorists. They went straight from these so-called radical activists to the mainstream. And part of these ag-gag laws, as they're called, ag is for agriculture and gag is to silence. They made no delineation between an activist investigator and a credentialed journalist. They put absolutely everybody at risk. So that's a long way of saying this project started because when I see books being banned or I see journalism being criminalized, my natural impulse as a journalist is to want to figure out ways of telling that story anyway, right? So I went out and bought some drones, and I was going to do investigations of farm pollution in defiance of these ag-gag laws. And the reason I was choosing that path is because animal agriculture in particular is one of the top contributors to climate change. And it's virtually unnoticed and not discussed in a lot of policy and environmental circles. Not just one of the top contributors to climate change, but there's a whole host of environmental consequences that we never really talk about and are out of sight. So the reason, though, this project started to change is I started to question like what it means to expose these industries. The drone photography was cool. Like you could see these massive waste lagoons, as they're called by the industry, that are just these open, sometimes football fields long pits of shit. And that's because these factory farms produce so much waste, there's nowhere for the waste to go. If you think about the little red barns of our imagination and the storybook past, animals are walking around in the grass and they poop on the grass and it goes in the field and then crops grow. And the natural world has this kind of like inherent beauty to it, right? Even when we're talking about cow waste. On factory farms, they're concentrated. You somehow have thousands or tens of thousands of animals in one place for chicken and egg production, sometimes you can have 1 million birds. And there's nowhere for this waste to go. And so they have to pump it out. It gets moved into these waste lagoons. And from there, all that sewage then gets pumped and sprayed sometimes onto the fields, right? And I knew about all this. Like I'd studied it. I've been working on these issues for years. And then I lost a drone. And it forced me to have conversations with people on the ground and in these communities that I would have still done as part of the reporting practice, but I don't know if I would have done in the same way. So in particular, I talk about in the book, I lost a drone. We had some technical issues. I made some phone calls because I had to like really figure out a way of salvaging this reporting trip. I met a woman named Helen who lived in these farming communities in Yakima Valley, Washington. And she had seen the Little Red Barn turn into these factory farms. And she took me around her community on what she called a poop tour. And it was just absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, it stuck with me in a way that rivaled some of the nastiest footage that I've seen, and also some of my own experiences. I've been on the slaughterhouse kill floors, I've been in factory farms, I've done both legal and illegal investigations, some of these that we had to cut in the early stages of the book after talking with lawyers as the stuff was being criminalized. And I just never seen anything like this. To give you an idea, when we went out in Yakima, we were driving down the road and she was making jokes about how I'd go home and get sick. She's like, everybody that comes out here gets sick. And I said, all due respect, Helen, this isn't my first rodeo. I've been on farms before. I've done this before. And being around those waste lagoons and then seeing the feces being spread in sprinkler systems and it's all being aerated. And so you stand there and you're just hit with this wave, even from blocks or a half mile away. You can't escape it in that town. And all I could think about was I've had bad asthma my whole life. And I grew up in Texas. I was born and raised there. I had family that worked on factory farms. I had no concept of any of this stuff. But I do remember being around the animals growing up, and it would trigger my asthma. And, it's a scary thing when you're a little kid. You can't find your inhaler, you don't know what to do. But just how many kids are in that community that don't have access to inhalers, or these are overwhelmingly immigrant populations? So that from the get started shaping this investigation. And really, what became a dominant theme throughout this book is it was a bit of an existential crisis as a journalist of what does it mean to see? Like, we've had these investigations, and I thought as a journalist, well, our responsibility is to share the footage. And if we do that, if we do bear witness, as we say in journalism, that people will see it and it will lead to change. But there's so many things that are not within that frame of the camera. We're missing, if we're getting the footage of the animal cruelty, the animals in battery cages, and there's footage of animals being sexually abused and all kinds of horrible stuff. What's not in the frame are some of these farming communities. And if we take the camera out and we're talking to Helen, what's often left out of the frame are the workers on these factory farms who are overwhelmingly immigrants. They don't have access to lawyers, and they're being told by the industry they have to turn over any wrongdoing that they see to the police. Right? So I started really wrestling with how do we tell this story anymore? The scale of factory farming is so enormous that you can never get it in the frame. You guys with me so far? What? So the investigation then started shifting again when, even though I was making progress and I was a plaintiff in some of these lawsuits challenging these censorship laws, we got some of them struck down. The industry kept evolving its tactics. So rather than outright criminalizing investigations, they started doing things like, well, it's okay to take photography and it's okay to document the bad things that are happening. We had no idea what was happening on their farms. But we think if you see something that we had no idea that was happening, you should have to turn over your footage within 24 hours. And anybody who's seen kind of a Law and Order episode, to build a case, you have to see a series of evidence, right? It's not just about the one bad apple. And so I started seeing all these like more and more sophisticated techniques that the industry was using to make us question what we were seeing. To them, it was just a bad apple. It's, oh, if you saw an animal being beaten or abused on tape, that was that low-level worker. And we got rid of them, right? Let's not talk about the systems that are in place from the top levels of this industry to industrialize and to make these standard industry practices. Let's blame it on the lowest level workers, the immigrants, the people that often don't even speak English, who can't get access to lawyers. And it got more and more complicated because I started seeing attempts to use advertising to make us directly question what these videos were showing. So all of a sudden you had ad campaigns that were calling for transparency of the industry themselves, as they're criminalizing journalism and as they're passing these censorship laws. They're like, well, we need more transparency in this industry. We want you all to see everything we're doing. There's industry campaigns to actually bring in cameras to slaughterhouses and factory farms. And so it just started breaking my brain. I couldn't reconcile how all of this was, how we could both expose this industry repeatedly and nothing changes, how we could expose the industry's censorship, and then they are using transparency as a marketing term. In a lot of ways, like I feel like it teed me up more and more for this moment that we're in, where truth and facts and everything is a little bit feeling completely upside down. And I think the industry's playbook on this is really telling. They use this imagery of the Red Barn in order to keep us in this constant state of confusion, of delegitimizing journalism, delegitimizing investigators, and using these kind of upside down narratives to make us trust what's happening. So this got to a point where like, I couldn't do this book anymore. This is why it took so many years, is because like I felt as a journalist to not understand what the story was, and not understand as someone who's specialized in, again, the cheery and uplifting beat of political repression and censorship, to not understand how these mechanisms of repression were working and why I was just like, maybe I'll do an ebook. Maybe I'll like just put this out as a series of YouTube videos. At the time, I was teaching at the University of Michigan and building a new journalism program and teaching specifically storytelling, right? So I was up to my eyeballs in narrative psychology and making the case to academics about why they should use storytelling techniques to share their research. And I was teaching young journalists investigative journalism. And I was just constantly immersed in this world and going back and forth, living on a farm in rural Michigan. And so I'd go back and forth by motorcycle every day on back roads and pass just dozens of these little red barns. And then finally one day it kind of clicked that I think the reason, despite the investigations, despite the overwhelming body of research about the environmental impact and climate change, the reason we're not seeing any of this is the story. The story is the Little Red. I mean, how many of y'all grew up with either the storybook, Old MacDonald, the little figurines? Was everybody? And it's not even just an American phenomenon. Old MacDonald is translated into dozens and dozens of languages all over the world. Countries that don't even historically use little red barns in terms of their agricultural history use this imagery in billboards and advertisements and storybooks to their kids. It's become the global narrative of what farming is. And the reason, from all the nerdy storytelling research I was doing, the reason that's so dangerous is when we are told this narrative before we learn any other cultural narratives, before we learn about God or the Pledge of Allegiance or capitalism, gender roles, anything, before we can even say our ABCs, we know about the Little Red Barn. And then as we get older, all the industry has to do is invoke that story, and it immediately triggers our natural confirmation bias, right? Which just means, and we've been shown repeatedly as a species, we want to believe what we think we already know is true. And we already know what a farm is. It's a little red barn. So when you go to the grocery store and you see all the eggs and butter and milk and animal products and everything, sometimes there's the store. I went to did a talk at Victoria Island uh, in Canada. That's not what it's called. What is the island? Vancouver Island. Um, University of Victoria. The grocery stores in town were called Little Red Barns, right? So sometimes we see it, sometimes it feels heavy-handed in the product advertisements, and a lot of times it's just like in the background. We see this constantly, and it brings us back to this familiar place that we all know, and so we can kind of set aside all those nasty videos you've seen, or all those extremists and terrorists that are talking about environmentalism and animal cruelty, and just trust us, right? So I thought at that point, okay, maybe I'm onto something. Like maybe this is the resolution of the book. Like this is starting to feel like I'm getting someplace. Um, and then January 6th happened. And the reason that disrupted this work even more is because really of a couple things. All of a sudden you had the FBI saying publicly, we would really love to go after these right-wing groups, these avowed, like well-known, high-ranking neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups that were photographed in the rotunda that are part of the January 6th insurrection. We really wish we could go after them, but our hands are tied. We don't have the power to go after groups like this as domestic terrorists. And I got into some heated arguments with colleagues at major media outlets. Because I'm just like, you all know my work. Like, what I've shown for the last 20 years. Not only is the FBI lying, but they've made nonviolent activism their top priority above all else. I even sent the receipts. With one interview in particular, I spent 3 hours on the phone with this really famous journalist and sent the reports. I was like, the FBI was audited by its inspector general and told that if it kept focusing on environmentalists, right-wing violence is going to spike and continue to rise. People are going to die. And the FBI said, we're going to stay the course. I sent them congressional reports, investigations. This has been told to the FBI for years, and they just didn't care. And then when all of those predictions come true, and you have white supremacists and the Oath Keepers and Three Percenters and the Proud Boys and all these far right groups. And I'm not saying that's the entirety of January 6th. It was actually quite a small group compared to the crowds that were there, but it's still like these are dangerous people. And the FBI allowed that to happen. They facilitated it by sending informants into environmental campaigns, by spying on vegan potlucks, which is something that's happened repeatedly, by creating dossiers about people like me. I have files from the counterterrorism unit monitoring my speeches and website and correspondence. Um, it's one of the only jokes I have when I was doing tour for Green is the New Red is the counterterrorism unit said it was compelling and well written. Right? Which is like you make dark jokes about this, and Elaine and I have done a lot of dark jokes about this shit, but at the same time, it's just like it breaks your brain a little bit of how all of that's happened, and the FBI still refuses to change course. But the other reason that January 6th kind of, as I say in the book, kind of broke my brain is that animals were present on January 6th. And you did see a lot of these white supremacists using, you having animal horns and the pelts. You started seeing the Trump boys talk about Black Lives Matter protesters as animals. You've seen this in the recent presidential election. It seems like animals had kind of an outsized role. You had Kristi Noem killing farm dogs and acting like it's just American way of life. You had RFK dumping bears out of his trunk, right? They're going to eat the cats and dogs, right? Talking about Haitian people. And it seemed like we are seeing animals. The FBI is not seeing and not acknowledging what's happening, but there's something here. Do you guys see what I'm saying with this? Um, and of course, there's a long history of that. I mean, my scholarly work is focused on the history of fascism and authoritarianism. And if there's one thing I've seen, and I think we've all seen who've done this research, is that when human beings start comparing other human beings to animals, it means the worst abuses are about to happen. Because to label someone an animal means they're a legitimate target of just unbridled violence, right? Because animals are a legitimate target of unbridled violence. They're not defined as animals under the law, right? As I was saying with the Animal Welfare Act. And it just felt like there was something here. And again, as a journalist, to not get it, to not see these like what have felt like two halves of my life. I care deeply about animal and environmental issues, which is kind of how I got into this world. But I'm also kind of just an old school civil liberties, political repression, trying to sound the alarm journalist. So my twin obsessions of animal and environmental issues, and then being hyper fixated on fascism and authoritarianism, it felt like two worlds. And I went on another motorcycle ride up north in Michigan. And on the way back, it kind of clicked. I started seeing those red barns, and they all had the Make America Great Again signs, or they had Blue Lives Matter, or they had some other variation of, those types of slogans. And what clicked for me, and where this book ultimately arrives, is that it's all the same story. If you think about what they're invoking with Make America Great Again, they're doing what fascists have always done, which is promise a return to a mythological past. If you look at the Third Reich, or Mussolini in particular, but also Franco, if you look at what's happened in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey, Putin, there's always this undercurrent of, well, you should give us power, you should trust us, you should give up your rights and go after the immigrants or whoever. Because if you do that, we're going to bring you back to a time when everything's okay, where a man was a man and a woman is a woman, and we didn't have all this trans people, right? Where we knew who our community is, and we didn't have all these immigrants, right? It's a return to this era that never existed, but that's the promise of fascism, that we're going to remove these things that are making our contemporary lives complex and difficult and messy, and we're going to go to a simpler time. And that simpler time is the Little Red Barn. There's a reason that Trump and a whole host of politicians use things like the Red Barn I talk about in the book as their backdrop for political events, because it's triggering, like I said, that return to this mythical past where everything's safe. It's wholesome. It's America. I mean, if you think about the Little Red Barn, see the full scope of it. You're going to see the happy farmer and the happy little pigs from our toy sets and the happy chickens and all that stuff, right? But if you widen your view just a little bit, that farm has the happy little farmer and his wife. It's always the man and the wife, right? They have the flag flying outside. They have the shotgun and they're defending their land, right? It symbolizes independence and entrepreneurialism. And there's just so much wrapped into this barn that's much more than just the farm and how animals are treated. Is this placeholder for a way of life. And it's a way of life that's very much coded in um, so-called traditional values and a return, again, anti-immigrant, anti-queer, anti-trans. Certainly, there's not going to be protesters on the farm, right? There's not going to be anarchists or socialists or anybody else causing any kind of trouble, right? And the reason I think this is so important, at least personally, is it changed how I think about the work I've done my entire life since I was a teenager. It's changed how I'm thinking about political repression that we're seeing right now and how we combat it as well. I arrived at a point, and this my thinking here is still kind of evolving after the book came out. Seeing what's unfolding right now and just how jarring it is, how the speed at which this is accelerating, the ease at which this is accelerating, it hit home to me that the real definition of fascism in my mind, or the real characteristics, we could talk about everybody from Timothy Snyder to Umberto Eco, and there's been all kinds of definitions over the years and lists of traits. And you'll probably know all of these. Like there's attacks on academics and journalists and immigrants are always the first hit. It's a consolidation of power under ultranationalism. We can really break that apart. To me, fascism, as I see it now, is really dependent on two things that I think you all need to know about in this moment. It's myth and it's fear. So the myth is both the little red barns and it's this false bill of goods that a lot of people in this country have bought into, that if we allow the dissolution of our democracy, it's going to take us back to this simpler era where, we're going to have more clarity about our lives and cultural norms and all these things. That's not new. But what I realize is that the people who are breaking that myth, the journalists, the activists, the poets, the storytellers, the academics, the immigrants, there's a reason they're always on the front lines of these attacks because they're breaking what John Gardner called the vivid continuous dream. Like there's something about story. I mean, Gardner is a literary theorist, but I think he really beautifully talks about this idea of the stories that we remember, the stories that are the most powerful are the ones where we lose ourselves. We get lost in this vivid and continuous dream. So whether you're watching or reading Dune or Star Wars, the science fiction stuff is easiest for me to use as an example because we just get entranced in it, right? It doesn't matter how fantastical it is or how absurd. If the story is good enough, we just get sucked into the vivid continuous dream and we're willing to suspend our disbelief. And I think that's what's happening right now in this country and around the world is that the narrative being pushed by fascists, this little red barns, is so vivid and so continuous that people are not able to see outside of it. And the people that are confronting ICE agents, snatching people off the street, or protesting here in San Francisco when you have the threat of troops being sent in, the ones who are breaking that dream are being labeled as enemies of the state. What, again, I didn't anticipate, though, with this project, much like when Green is the New Red came out, and then I saw these ag-gag laws, this book came out, and recently I was in New York doing some talks and did an interview on Democracy Now! Because anti-fascists have been labeled as the new domestic terrorism threat. There's a national security memo, NSM-7, that I encourage people to check out. You don't have to be a lawyer or policy nerd. It's written in very conversational language, talking about destroying the left and going after funding and resources and nonprofits, all under this framework of terrorism and specifically targeting anti-fascists. And when I see that, it is a direct, like you could tie a string from what I was writing about in Green is the New Red to right now with this designation of anti-fascists as terrorists. It is the exact playbook. And I don't mean that like, oh, there's comparisons and this is useful in a book talk to say that I've talked about this previously. It is the same. So when that designation came out, you had I got in some more arguments. I'm not an argumentative person. I probably sound like I'm a friendly person. But people are just saying the most outrageous shit after that. You had journalists saying, well, this is absurd. This is President Trump doesn't know what he's doing because you can't actually designate a domestic group as a terrorist organization. And like, this is another example of our cartoonish, clownish president, right? Cracking jokes. I'm like, you guys aren't getting it. You 100% can do that. And they've done that with environmentalists for over 25 years. And they put people in secretive prison units. They gave them red cards in prison, designating them as terrorists. They ruined people's lives. You had journalists that had grand jury subpoenas. You had informants and surveillance networks being used in ways that I think most people have no idea how long this has been going on. So then when you have somebody like Trump step into power and decide to expand that network to anti-fascist, the whole playbook is already there. And you guys following me on that? Like this isn't a Trump is fascist issue. This isn't a Democrat or Republican. These policies have been institutionalized for decades. And now, as we have someone who's clearly an authoritarian, he's able to turn those levers and use it against his enemies and whoever he wants. I know I'm dumping a lot of dark and kind of overwhelming information on you all, but the reason I wanted to kind of give that big picture of all of the different pieces of this book rather than just the animal rights component or the factory farms or the environmental impact is because I think we have to see it all together to understand the dangers that we're really facing right now. And I struggled with that. Before I called it kind of an existential crisis because it felt that way. I mean, as a journalist, I've spent my whole life saying in forums like this and being personally motivated by the belief that if we can shine a light on the dark things that are happening, by doing that, by bearing witness, others will be able to see it. And that's how social change is made. That might be a little bit simplistic or Pollyanna of me over the years, but I think it's also a coping mechanism. I've told myself, okay, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix any of this stuff. But as a journalist, I know how to do this work. I know how to investigate, expose, document. And if I do that, that's how I play my role. And through the course of this project, I really started to question them of how do we make anyone see any of this anymore? After January 6th, how is it that an entire social movement disappeared? How is it that decades of political repression against these activists far and away, what am I trying to say here? Disproportionately compared to any other social movement has just been erased. There's no discussion of it. Civil liberties groups aren't acknowledging it. All of a sudden, we're talking about this right-wing violence without any context because we haven't just made the animal cruelty disappear. We've made the entire repression of these movements disappear. And it got to the point, it felt like it was just breaking me. And I don't mean to be hyperbolic in that, but I couldn't process like, what is my role here? What's any of our roles? If it's not enough to tell the truth, what are we supposed to do? And I say all of that because through this process of writing the book, I returned to this concept of bearing witness. And the section I wanted to read tonight, and then we'll have time for some questions and discussion, is about that. This is towards the end. And maybe as a little bit of a setup for this, as part of my investigation, I was also investigating that history of bearing witness. And what I realized is that sometimes in popular discussion, it's really reduced to just seeing. So sometimes we think that bearing witness means to passively like doom scroll on our phones, like, oh, we don't know what to do about this horrible things going on all over the world, and so let's just scroll through genocide footage or let's scroll through ICE raids. The history of the term actually means two things. It means to see and then to testify about what you've seen. So it's not just about punishing ourselves with bad things that we have to expose ourselves to. It's seeing it and then publicly speaking out about it. Let this be my testimony then. We have within us the ability to see it all. We can see the animals, the workers, and the Helens. We can see the environmental crisis and the fascist threat. We can see the stories hiding it all. We can also see more, let our view widen beyond the story of the farm. We can see the genocide abroad, the poverty at home. We can see our neighbors and we can see ourselves. Bearing witness to it all together doesn't make any one of these sites less egregious. It doesn't make me less of an animal advocate to see the farm workers. And it doesn't make human rights concerns less valid by acknowledging animal suffering. Instead, by seeing the stories that connect these victims, we begin to see something else entirely. Not a collection of siloed, fragmented causes, but instead a conjoined, interconnected, monstrous mess. I warn you that this approach to social issues comes with the cost. Bearing witness to the full scale of this crisis, including how we are personally implicated, is frustrating and exhausting, to put it mildly. It feels like pulling that box of Christmas decorations out of the attic and finding a knotted ball of lights. And it's always tempted to closing the lid and putting it back, because where do you start? The more I open myself to truly witness, the more nuanced my thinking becomes, the more maddeningly complex and interconnected. Although I've maintained my values, I've moved further away from puritanical solutions and holier-than-thou rhetoric. I'm increasingly able to see my own behaviors and judgment through the eyes of the witness. Media scholar Sue Tate called this the, quote, embodied knowledge of suffering, the limit experience that defies representation. Bearing witness is more than observing injustice. It's allowing that trauma to shape you and to guide your response. This is a practice available to all of us. You don't need to be an undercover investigator or a crisis journalist. We can embrace it in our daily lives as a way of living and navigating this world. To witness is to put yourself on the front lines, physically at times, but also emotionally. To embody witnessing is to embody empathy. The more I've allowed myself to see, the more humble and connected to others I feel. Bearing witness means to face the onslaught of the world, all of its darkness and evils, and do so with not just our eyes open, but also with our full hearts, so that we can hold space for that suffering and allow it to change us. The fear people have, I think, is that bearing witness to suffering means your life will also be suffering. I think the opposite is true. By bearing witness, our view of the entire world changes, both shadow and light. I've now spent most of my life bearing witness to humanity at its worst, and in doing so, I've placed myself in positions where I've also been able to witness humanity at its best. Even in the most bleak stories of injustice and loss, I've seen bone-chilling heroism, empathy, and grace. By bearing witness, we take in shared pain and trauma, but through that act, somehow, miraculously, more space opens up within us, and it is love, rage, and courage that flows into it. As a journalist, this is the faith I've found in witnessing, that we're all strong enough to look, that to bear witness, even when you might be attacked or imprisoned, is an act of spiritual defiance. That if we speak about what we have seen, others will see it too, and through our collective action, our shared testimony, we will write a new story together. In that spirit, I really feel grateful to be back here with City Lights and in this town, in this store right now as all this is unfolding. It feels both eerie and surreal and also kind of poetic and wonderful to be here with you. So in that spirit, thank you all for coming and happy to have questions and conversation.
So for those of you in the room, try to remember, allow me to come to you. Otherwise, the folks online aren't going to be able to hear. I'll give you a moment to think about it. We do have some online already.
Sure.
Derek says, this is an excellent book, highly recommended. It's a two-part question. In the last chapter, you talk about journalism versus fiction in terms of impact on the public, citing the jungle. Do you have any additional thoughts on the changing role of journalism and the potential of fiction as a method of telling the same story more effectively in terms of public policy influence? And then number two, while
Right.
City Lights, do you want me to
No, that's
leave it
okay.
at that?
I'm
Okay.
gonna keep it.
Number two, while City Lights published this book, this is not the first stop on the book tour. Are there any questions that you have been asked on the road during your tour that you want to reshare and re-answer now?
Choice. Well, to the first part, I'm sure you all know, but the reference is to Upton Sinclair, who the book is dedicated to and has really kind of shaped my thinking as a young journalist, but also shaped it in different ways to the course of this work. And people know Upton Sinclair and know The Jungle. It used to be required reading in high schools. I'm sure some of you might have had it. The narrative is that when Upton Sinclair exposed what was happening in slaughterhouses, that exposure is what led to the passage of the Food and Drug Act, and there was different protections and consumer safety laws and sanitation laws because the public was so disgusted by rats being ground up. And this was in 1904, 1905, rats being ground up and entering meat products and things like that. What is often left out of this, and the person online mentioned, is that this was a work of fiction. It was based on Sinclair's investigations, and he tried to publish that. He did publish it in a socialist newspaper called Appeal to Reason as a series of reported pieces, and it kind of landed with a thud. It didn't make the impact. As a kind of nerdy aside, Steinbeck did the same thing. Before Grapes of Wrath, there was a series of newspaper articles about migrant workers. There's a long history here of investigative kind of muckraking journalists arriving at a similar point that I did of why is it not enough to just expose the truth? And I think I have a lot of thoughts on that. A lot of them are kind of left out of the book, but I think the potential of fiction is quite underestimated in political and kind of activisty circles, and especially as we're talking about social change. Because even though, like, if this is the dominant narrative, the only thing we can do is write a story. Like, there's a limit to how much exposure and fact-based refutation of that we can do. Ultimately, I think to inspire people and inspire movements and to chart a different course, you have to let people see the story, see a different story of what's possible. So to answer that question, I'm still struggling with it. I have a fiction project, as we all do, that I've been working on for years, that at different points during this book became a procrastination method of like, oh, maybe I should spend, I'm totally justified spending time on this instead, because maybe that's how we reach people. But to answer that, I don't know. And I don't think any of us know, like, what are the stories that finally break through and start shaping and reshaping culture? For folks online or in the room that aren't investigative journalists, this is all a long way of saying there's other ways of using kind of what I'm talking about to change popular opinion, to change our world. And that's why places like City Lights are so important, because it's not just, the nonfiction in the basement, it's the poetry up here, it's the fiction on the ground level, right? All of those things are contributing to how we view the world. So the latter part, I'm a little hesitant on that because I don't want to like steal anyone's questions or thunder that they have. But we were talking about it during dinner, how I've been surprised on book tour. Years ago, a lot of the first questions would be, how do we make sure we're not prosecuted as terrorists? What do we do to protect our privacy and our phones? How do we make sure that the people in the room are not undercover informants, right? They're a lot more like kind of fear initiated, tactical and specific questions about how we do this. I've been really struck how much of the conversation in a lot of ways is more about how we process it, how we make sense of this. And I think that's really telling to me. I talk candidly in the book about my own struggles throughout, both with depression and finally being diagnosed with really severe PTSD that I didn't have a vocabulary of understanding what that was. And through that, it's kind of shaped how I'm doing this moment too. I thought I would share that. In trauma responses, we think about fight or flight. We all know that, right? But there's also a freeze response where your nervous system kind of shuts down and you aren't fighting or fleeing, you're just stuck. And then in uh, psychology now, they've kind of added in recent years also a fawn response, which means that particularly if you're like in an abusive relationship or there's an extreme power dynamic and you can't fight, you can't flee, and you really can't freeze either, you fawn, meaning you try to bring yourself closer to the people that are actually harming you to try to keep yourself safe. And when I see what's happening in this country right now, I see all of it through that lens. I think a lot of people are frozen. I think a lot of people with good hearts and good intentions are frozen, and we don't know what to do. There's some people fighting. There's some people fleeing. We've seen the news about some of the top scholars of fascism are starting to leave. And I'm seeing a lot of people falling. And I'm not saying that we excuse all of this behavior through this like trauma lens, but I think it's important to remember. And maybe there's like something to be said by incorporating that into how we move out of rooms like this and talk to people rather than seeing everyone as like this kind of polarized us or them narrative, maybe trying to see their humanity of there's a lot of good intentioned people that don't know what the hell to do or I think are just completely frozen. I promise I won't be so long on all the answers here.
Hi, obligatory wanted to start off with what an amazing book to have read. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
publishing it, for writing it. My question for you is, uh, when you were describing like the myth behind the little red barn, something that came to mind for me was Carol Adams' book, The Sexual Politics of Meat. She talks about like the happy animals, how they're like that image of them, and she writes it like as like the animal running into the knife, like as if they are inviting this oppression upon them. And I wanted to know, or I wanted to ask, if you agree with this, and if you do, like what role it has into this myth building that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, what a great question. So in Carol Adams' work, she talks about this idea of the absent referent, right? And so that's what she's describing. Like you'll see these kind of, as you described, like cartoonish images of like a sexy pig or a sexy cow that's kind of like asking for it, so to speak, right? That is inviting both the gaze and their treatment. And she really makes, and I think is well known for making the case of what's absent in that reference is the lack of consent and the power dynamics here. And I view in a lot of ways this is kind of an extension. I don't think we're making exactly the same argument, but they're very complementary because in some ways that's kind of what I'm articulating as well of how story works to obscure what's really being referenced. The image of the little red barn is to mask the change in animal agriculture that has completely redefined the industry. Just like those cartoonish images of the happy little sexy pigs and cows or whatever are masking the fact that the standard industry practices of this, how these 10 billion animals are raised and killed for food are absolutely egregious. And so I think they kind of fit together. And I think we could even extend it a bit more what Carol describes as that absent referent or these kind of like weaponized storytelling narratives, as I describe them. We see that in so many other ways. It's been shocking. I don't know how many of y'all follow like or see the viral stories of like the DHS social media accounts. So let me. This has been. It's one thing to make an argument like this, like theoretically. Seeing it unfold, they're sharing these like uh, very nostalgic images of like the white family on the farm, the westward expansion. They shared things the other day about like defending hearth and home. And it was all these swords about, getting rid of the immigrants. And it's all the same, sorry, it's all the same shit, right? It's all the same narratives being weaponized and sold back to people. So I appreciate that question very much. I think what I realized is once you start seeing stories in this way, you see them everywhere. And for me, there's also been kind of a liberatory potential there because you see that they're just stories. And we could just as easily tell a different story. We could remove these kind of cartoonish images and reframe them as a different narrative to spin. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for being here. I think I heard your interview on KLW or NPR, and the thing that shocked me is when you're discussing why we drink milk. I don't, but it's a when I first came to this country, I couldn't believe people actually sat down and would have a glass of milk with dinner, and I think that's disgusting. But I haven't seen people do it in San Francisco. But that was shocking to me. But there's something else that changed my life was years ago. I remember seeing a document. It might have been a 60 Minutes expose of the slaughterhouses in the South and how the hamburger is equally disgusting. You mentioned an earlier version where they grind up rats, but in the modern version, everything goes into that hamburger, including the contents of bowels and everything else. And there's no the awful the abuse of the immigrant labor. I have never looked at a hamburger since. I mean, that did it for me. It also made me, I didn't know anything about this, but the abuse of the migrant labor. I mean, those are the only people who would do those jobs. That just shocked me. Is there any way, I suppose it's too dangerous to do a documentary now?
To do a documentary of
What your book is about.
talking to folks about everything.
Oh, well, that's good to know. Well, good luck.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
No, it's getting more difficult. I will say though that as journalism has been criminalized, especially in farms, people are finding out more and more innovative ways of continuing to document. There have been investigators doing things with not just drones, but 360, like not virtual reality, but immersive cameras. They've put cameras in everything from waste lagoons to the kill floor to corners of the slaughterhouses. So I think there's this constant push and pull that as techniques of exposing the truth are criminalized, people find out more creative ways of getting that information out there. But to the first part of what you were saying, yeah, it's been shocking to me. Like I thought I knew all that, but seeing it first person was something else. And talking to a lot of the workers in particular, one of the things I talk about in the book is that human rights organizations have done investigations as well. So this is not just me telling these stories, but a lot of these workers having to wear adult diapers because they don't have time. They're not allowed time to go to the restroom. The speed of the slaughterhouse kill lines is just jaw dropping. I mean, I've been usually in these talks, I try not to bombard you guys with the gruesome stuff, but I'll tell just a little bit about this. It's just a blur. When the chickens come through the lines in particular, it's a blur. And that has a few consequences. One is that the animals are frequently not killed, cleanly or intentionally or whatever language you want to use. But that also has repercussions for the workers too, because you have to keep up with that speed. And the reason I wanted to note that is this administration is now trying to uncap all the line speeds. And there's been a variety of different efforts over the years from the first Trump administration to now of removing those restrictions. So those restrictions are in place not just for the animals, they're there for the workers and they're there for public safety. too, because in that blur, the workers are also supposed to be able to not be able. They're supposed to be monitoring the animals for abscesses and lesions and signs of being diseased as well. Similarly, with these undercover investigations, some of the footage that was being criminalized, and the reason the industry hit back so hard is because investigators filmed cows that were too sick to walk. They're called by the industry downers because it's so common. Being pushed by front loaders and heavy equipment so the industry can still get that last few bucks, right? But you can't let sick animals enter the food supply. And in that case, it was here in California at a place called Hallmark, Westmoreland. It led to the largest meat recall in US history because those animals were slated to be fed to children as part of the National School Lunch Program. So no matter which way you parse this here, or I guess I should say, no matter which lens through which you're viewing this issue, it's really putting all of us at risk.
One of the things you talk about in your book is the international, the spread of these laws internationally, but also the global impact of industrial agriculture and the amount of resources it uses and the role it plays in climate change on a global level and the kinds of influence that these various agricultural industries have on things like climate change initiatives and any attempt to do anything about that in international forums. And I don't think, I mean, I see other things entering into the public consciousness via different methods. But I don't see that. I don't see, everyone is aware of fossil fuels, but nobody talks about the things that you talk about that are really kind of mind-boggling in the book, and the way in which this isn't just the United States implementing these laws in order to squash knowledge about these things, but that this is a global campaign because this industry is a global industry.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you wanted to highlight that a little bit.
Yeah, appreciate it. That's a huge part of this story. The Little Red Barn is being exported in two ways, right? One, what I documented in Green is the New Red, as I was seeing that spread domestically, those tactics were also spreading internationally. So the mechanisms of labeling environmentalists and animal activists as terrorists has now spread all over the world. It's listed in Europol reports. Investigators are called terrorists. I've done speaking tours in Australia and throughout Europe. Canada has ag laws. Australia does. They're being copied and pasted. Like American laws being copied and pasted in other legal systems to shut down protest. But at the same time, the American, what is an inherently American invention of the factory farm is being exported globally too. So now in China, they're actually building skyscrapers of hog factory farms, dozens of floors. I mean, can you imagine? I know I just gave you a glimpse of what some of these places are like with the waste lagoons, but now skyscraper after skyscraper, because meat consumption and meat demand is expanding in areas like China, where it was cost prohibitive and it was like a wealthy indulgence before. But the reason we don't see and hear about a lot of it is because there's a covert campaign by these industries to censor and actually rewrite the science. So I think a lot of people are familiar with how big tobacco and big oil have done this, right? So I think tobacco is probably the best or one of the best comparisons, even though I talk about big oil at length in the book. But you remember for decades we had research coming out. Smoking is not that bad for you. Actually, your doctors are smoking and doctors are being featured in ads, right? And the industry is doing the same thing. They've actually, I don't know what's happening. The industry is doing the same thing in the sense that they're propping up sham scientists. They're actually funding research centers. There's a big one in Colorado. They're now spreading elsewhere, where they're giving. Should we try to? You guys hear okay?
I can see what I can do about it. There's something holding in place.
Not that. I thought I had long arms. The
Yeah, I'm
so I say they're propping up these sham scientists. They're giving them money. They're building research centers. And what do you know? If you're on the industry payroll, you're suddenly putting out research that is saying exactly what the industry wants to be said. But not only that, but I found in the climate conferences, the international climate summits, the industry will do things like put pressure on those governmental bodies to actually strip mentions of factory farms, animal agriculture, plant-based diets. The most innocuous mentions of both problems and solutions are being cut from these reports. And that's significant because these are the bodies and these are the reports that are then shaping how nation states around the world are designing policies ostensibly to combat the climate crisis. And in short, they're cooking the books. I mean, they're propping up fake research and then deliberately removing that data and putting pressure, especially from the heavy meat producing countries, to remove that. The consequence of that, it's both left out of the public discussion, but if you look at the research, it is truly overwhelming how much is coming out right now about the scale of impact of animal agriculture. Some of the things I talk about in the book is there have been multiple, we're talking about peer-reviewed, multinational research teams published through universities like Oxford, right? That are talking about, even if we do all the other carbon mitigation strategies, if we don't address animal agriculture, we physically cannot meet the requirements of keeping global warming, whatever the 2-degree change in check. It's not possible. So it's chilling because some of the greatest threats to basically our survival as a species are being stripped from policy documents, court records, and government proceedings. I'll say on top of that, to make this an even more cheery and uplifting note, I got to the point in this book that I kind of told myself I'm done making warnings. Authoritarianism is here. I don't really know what else my role is right now. Like it's happened, the stuff I was trying to warn about for many, many years. But there is an additional warning I tried to make in the book, is that issue, the environmental crisis, is intersecting with the rise of authoritarianism. And that's something I think is also left out of the discussion. That as the climate crisis accelerates, we're going to see nations go further and further down this authoritarian path. They're going to blame it on the immigrants. We don't have enough water. We don't have enough food. Keep the foreigners out. Shut down protests. They're disrupting the system, right? By the same token, these are the same types of people that are fueling and funneling money and support into that climate denialism. So it is this interconnected, monstrous mess that we have to see the environmental impact and its connection to these far-right groups.
Hi, my name is Woody.
Woody.
Thanks so much for writing the book. Haven't read it yet, but I've got it already, so looking forward to reading it. I happen to work at a climate policy organization, work on climate policy in Sacramento. And this is kind of timely because just today we learned, work in coalition a lot. And one of our coalition partners, the Center for Biological Diversity, we just learned this today, that there's a list. You probably know about this. There's a list. And it was presented to the president, and the president said, "Yeah, go after him." Basically, so we're number one. We're trying to find out if we're on the list, that kind of thing, and I mean, I just want to say, you're talking about the suppression that's happening in sort of climate policy. They're now going after the source, so they don't have to keep stomping out fire. So we battle big oil, big utility, and big ag. And I'd just say, from where I sit, I mean, certainly there's bullshit and obstruction and threats and challenges from big oil all the time, and big
Mhm.
utilities not far behind them. But the one that seems the most difficult, you talk about suppressing, just what we would think of as innocuous suggestions and ideas, and plant-based diets and whatnot, seems to be the one that's the sort of rises up as being really sort of sidelined, oppressed, pushed back. So what you're talking about resonates for me. And I guess my question is, back to the question that you sort of reiterated from previous things, is like, what's the top thing we should do to try to deal with it?
I appreciate that. I just met someone last night. I did a panel in Oakland who came up and works at Center for Biological Diversity, and was like, "Hey, we just got briefed that they're coming after us as part of this going after anti-fascists." Um, I was stunned, honestly, because in some ways, not surprised, but it felt like that national security memo was signaling like going after the people on the ground in Portland and Chicago, right? But it's much much worse than kind of envisioned, is that they're using that to go after the mainstream NGOs. I'll add to that something that's even more chilling is we've seen the resurgence of the conspiracy cases against protesters. This is something that goes back to the Red Scare of you can't prosecute someone for actually doing illegal activity, so you argue they're part of a criminal conspiracy. They use RICO, which is the mob law. We saw that in Atlanta with the Cop City protests recently. We're seeing it all over the place. And that's where I see some of this stuff going. These aren't just empty threats. I think there's a real risk of both using conspiracy charges against mainstream organizations and also trying to go after their tax exempt status, which has been huge in the news lately. Even a couple months ago, everyone was kind of bracing, as you know, for environmental groups being stripped of their nonprofit status. Trump didn't follow through with that announcement, but I say that as context. Like, this is where all this is heading. To your question, I'm both hesitant to answer that for a variety of reasons, but I feel like that's on the front of everybody's mind. In short, I think when we're seeing these tactics unfold, the best things we can do are return to community. We have to build structures in place through mutual aid and solidarity to weather these storms. To me, one of the biggest lessons of this book, the reason that we were able to strike down some of those censorship laws, is we finally got this multi-issue coalition on board. It wasn't just the animal activists. We had groups like CBD, we had environmental groups, Sierra Club, we had the Teamsters and labor unions. We had the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, which was kind of a strange bedfellows alliance because they're trying to put our people in prison. But they were part of this group that said, hey, if we criminalize this information and these investigations, it's putting all of us at risk. And I think that to me is the lingering kind of marching orders of how we move forward. And we have to pull together people that we might not be ideologically lockstep in line with to get all of us in this kind of diverse coalition to realize what's at stake if we don't. I think what happens on every time in any kind of like left of center, liberal, progressive, whatever you want to call it, space is we get fixated on this like tyranny of small differences and purity politics and trying to show that we're more radical or more environmental or more animal or oh they're not vegan or we have all these reasons of just shit talking and attacking other people and we miss the actual tyranny that's unfolding in front of us. And so I guess I'll say in terms of tactics and strategy, that's what we have to do. um, I'm hearing a lot of conversation these days, and I've spoken at some conferences where people are talking about building a bigger tent, meaning like, hey, we need to find a way to bring the far right. They have a reason to care about animals. Everybody can care about the environment. And I've pushed back really hard about that. I think we do need to build a bigger tent, but it needs to be a tent that's encompassing all of the diverse civil rights, social justice groups. In short, if there's one thing I've seen throughout my work, like in terms of studying fascism historically, is bootlicking never works. Um, Trying to cozy up with power never works, and the only way to respond to it is to build strong networks of people that are willing to defend each other and step up right now.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. From online, what are the most impactful words to say to non-vegans to bring about an impactful change to being vegan?
Yeah. Maybe I'll take one more question. No. um, it's tough to say. I'll say, I talk about in the book, I went vegan when I was a teenager. For me, it was a friend of mine. I remember we were walking, I was a DJ at the college radio station. I grew up in the punk and hardcore scene. And I went vegetarian because we were walking I had a punk show. And she was just straight up like, hey, you care about all these other social issues and you're going to these different protests. Like, have you ever thought about this? And she kind of did a little, top line summary of this is about animals, environment, workers. And I was like, I had no idea. And that was, to me, that was enough. And then I was at a punk show and I saw video footage for the first time in the mid 1990s. And then that like changed the entire course of my life. Other people I've met have seen the footage and read the stuff and don't want to make that change. And so it's really tough to answer that question because I don't know. I mean, it's such a personal, food is culture. And I think we have to accept that when we're talking to people about the issues wrapped up in a book like this, under all of it is a story about culture and how they grew up in their family, the meals that they've made together, what holidays are like together. And so I don't know what the silver bullet is to break through on certain issues, because I think for everybody it's a little bit different. And I guess a hope I had with this book, and Elaine and I were like really deliberate as we're looking through and revising and editing. I didn't want this to be a vegan book. This is not an animal rights book. It is that, but it is all these other things. And so to me, that's how we broaden that discussion, is saying, you don't have to read this and go out and be vegan. If you do that, that's great. But I hope you are able to carry things forward that you are able and comfortable to incorporate in your life. I talk about in the book, during the height of all the ag-gag stuff, I was just on the road nonstop trying to fight these laws. And I gave a talk in Tennessee. And these students came up afterwards and they're like, we appreciate your talk. We're all going vegan. And I was like, that's great. I don't understand how you arrived at that point. Like, I'm talking about press freedom, censorship laws. And to them, their answer stuck with me. They said, your work is documenting people trying to live by their values. And it makes us want to live by our values too. And that's the heart of it to me. So to you all, whatever that means to you, I hope you make, and certainly the best way to have an environmental impact is to reduce or eliminate your consumption of animals. But if this in any way inspires you to live by your values too, whether it's resisting ICE raids or going vegan or vegetarian or all of the above, I think that's welcomed and should be embraced.
Anyone else? Well, then on that note, thank you so much, Will.
Thank you all so much. Talk to folks after if you have books. I'm happy to sign books and all that stuff. Thank you all for coming. I don't know. 2 books of what? Well, thanks so much for coming.